All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and get this party started. So, thank you so much for joining us today for Not Throwing Away Your Shot. We are pleased to have Dr. Dasgupta he's an innovation fellow from the Gilling School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina. And I know that this is a very heated topic for many of us, and a lot of us in the field have gotten lots of questions, and hopefully Dr. Dasgupta will be able to answer those for us today. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, so if you do not want to be on camera, please keep your videos turned off, and we also request that you keep yourselves muted unless asked to come off of mute. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Dasgupta. Oh, Dr. Dasgupta, we're not able to hear you.
All right, double muted. Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. My name is Nab, and we all have questions about COVID vaccines, but the technical nature of that information can make it really hard to understand what is real. But there's a whole bunch of scientists like me out there who spend all their time thinking about drug safety and vaccine safety. And so today I'm going to let you in on some of the secrets and some of the tools that we use in the profession to really understand the safety of new drugs and new vaccines, and specifically the COVID vaccines. I understand that a lot of you on the phone today are service providers, where you have a responsibility to care for the people who come to your program, to come to your clinic. And in that position of trust, I can imagine a big sense of responsibility to give folks the most accurate information possible. And that's really hard to do, right? When the information is changing all the time and there's just a lot of noise out there. So for those of us who are scientists in this field, there's a set of tools and a specific language that we use that I'll walk you through, and will help kind of point you to how you can get the best information to the people that you care for. So, like I said, I'm a side effect scientist, and I've been doing this work for about 2 decades. I'm at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in public health. And I've spent nearly 20 years calling pharma out on different problems that there have been with their drugs and vaccines and devices. And so at my data lab at UNC, we do a lot of field research, talking to patients. We do large database analytics, laboratory benchtop experiments, and put together all that information, really synthesizing it into kind of what is the real risk with a new vaccine or a new medication. A lot of my work has been in opioids and calling out safety concerns with opioid analgesics. I come from a background of harm reduction and of freedom of choice and body autonomy. I believe that we have a right to know what goes into our bodies, whether it's food or tea or drugs, and that we can make good choices if we are provided with truthful information. So that's where I'm coming from, and I hope that what I can provide to you today will give you some new tools to help start those conversations in a respectful way with the people that you care about. So to start with, let's get right to the heart of the matter, where it is totally reasonable to have concerns about the speed of the approval process for the vaccines. That is totally reasonable. For years, we've heard from pharma that it takes billions of dollars in a decade to bring new products to market, right? So it's really weird for there to suddenly be like, oh, no, we can do this just in 1 year, right? So why did that happen this time? Well, there's some underlying reasons that I can fill you in on, which might give you a more nuanced view of what happened and why this moved so quickly. First of all, there's a lot of scientists who have worked for decades behind the scenes to do the basic science research that enables this technology and that technology for the vaccines. So, for example, in my own life, in 1999, the first paper I published was on vaccine delivery using the same type of system that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine uses. So there's a lot of us who've been doing this work for a long time. About a decade ago, there was two mini pandemics or large-scale outbreaks, one called SARS, one called MERV, Middle Eastern Respiratory Virus. And during both of those, there was a lot of discussion like, hey, we should really have an mRNA vaccine for this. We really have the technology we need to make this reality, to create a vaccine really quickly. But you know what? It was a follow the money game where there weren't enough people who got infected to entice the pharmaceutical companies to take that next step and develop those vaccines. And I'll be honest, there was a little bit of, oh, this is happening in the Middle East, this is happening in Southeast Asia. Those countries aren't rich enough to pay for these vaccines. So there wasn't really a huge financial incentive to do what it needed to be done, even though we could have done it then to prevent those deaths and those pandemics. It didn't happen. Well, at least we're in better times now, and some of the technology can, we can let go of some of that baggage and understand that this is something that we all need to do and all need to understand in order for us to get back to our normal lives. So that's a little bit of the history there, right? In addition, okay, so when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of basic science in the bank, but let's get to this. Let's get to like one of the trickiest terms, fast track. Okay, I'm sure you guys have heard this term by now, or likely you have, that the vaccine was fast tracked. Now, when we use that word in English, it has certain connotations. We attribute meaning to it based on how we use that kind of casually in our lives, right? We want our pizza to be fast tracked so we can get it before anybody else. But when it comes to vaccines and it comes to the government regulations that surround vaccines, that phrase has a really specific meaning, okay? All it really means is that FDA has to reply to emails from the pharmaceutical company in a timely manner. That's all that really, really means. It doesn't mean that the scientific requirements don't change at all. So what happens normally with drug and vaccine development is that a company will do all the studies, put together what's called a dossier, huge binder of all the studies and all the reports. And they've been sending those kind of summaries of that along to the agency throughout the development process. But when they're ready to call it, they send that huge document in. And once that arrives at FDA, the clock starts ticking. And normally that clock doesn't have a time limit. The agency can choose to reply whenever they want. When there are drugs or vaccines where there is a really strong reason to keep that cycle going a little bit faster than usual, that's when they use fast track. So it basically means when the company sends an email to FDA asking a question, the FDA has to reply within a certain number of days. And it also sets out a very structured schedule for face-to-face meetings to discuss the details of the studies. It doesn't mean a compromise on the science. Now, I will just say that there is a separate way to speed up the development process for vaccines where cutting corners on the science is allowed. And that's called expedited approval. I'll be very clear here. None of the COVID vaccines have gone through expedited approval. Expedited approval is only used when there is, and it's used very rarely. And it's only used when there's already, a dozen products that are very, very similar, nearly identical, and there's enough safety information that those products have been on the market long enough that that the scientific requirements for the new products are lowered. But that is not being discussed here. I've not heard expedited approval being even floated for these vaccines. So I think fast track gets often confused, and we put our own values into those words, but really it has like this really kind of bureaucratic, technical meaning to it. It also is something that allows FDA to devote more doctors and scientists to reviewing the vaccine than they would have normally had access to. So it's kind of like a bureaucratic reshuffling term. But in the news media, it's really easy to get to have that misinterpreted. Okay. The other related term is emergency use authorization. EUA is the acronym. And that's a really heavy term, right? Like it evokes things when I hear it. I'm a little bit like, oh, okay, that's got to mean something, and it does mean something. So emergency use authorization actually has a meaning that I think is the opposite of the way that it sounds. Emergency use authorization, so in a normal drug or a normal vaccine, what happens is that the company gets approval for the drug and they have to continue monitoring its safety, but they really don't have to pay, they don't have to keep investing in new studies to show that it's effective, okay? That's the normal process. But before there were any COVID vaccines being really developed, FDA decided that all the COVID vaccines really should have ongoing review of the effectiveness, not just the safety, but the effectiveness and the safety. And that's really different from the way most vaccines and drugs are developed. Usually we wait until that there's all this information, and then after that, the manufacturers don't have to do any more proof. But the emergency use authorization is this technical designation that forces the company to come back to the table on a periodic basis, like over the next few months after launch, and show additional data that shows that the vaccine is working. Okay, this is really different, and I think this is a powerful tool to not let the manufacturers off the hook once the vaccines come to market. It also allows FDA to pull the vaccine from the market much easier than a traditional approval process. So traditionally, like if you get a safety signal for a drug and you want it to come off the market, because of that signal, there's a lot of legal steps that need to be done. With emergency use authorization, FDA has the authority to make that happen a lot quicker based on the effectiveness data. Okay, so those are like two kind of very technical terms that are kind of have meanings that you wouldn't expect just on face value. But both of those combined actually create a better and more scientific transparency, and also allow there to be more resources for the vetting of the vaccines. And I think that's really important. So, I think when it comes to the vaccines, each of these vaccines are different, and they use different ingredients, they have different mechanisms, but they're all trying to do the same thing. When we are talking to the people that we have a responsibility to, whether that's in our family or in our jobs, we would like to, it's hard to tell them just, oh, you should get the vaccine, right? I don't like being told what to do with my body. And a lot of people don't like to be told what to do with their body. Right now, there's a lot of societal pressure, a lot of people saying, you need to get the vaccine, you should get the vaccine. There's going to be, it's not inconceivable that there will be mandates to get vaccinated in order to do certain types of activities, maybe to get on a plane, maybe to go back to school. None of those have really happened yet, but it's easy to imagine that scenarios where that could happen. So when we feel like that creates anxiety in me. And when we feel pressure to do something that we're not totally comfortable with, and when we feel helpless, that's when we are more likely to believe in things that are outside of the realm of truth. Okay, this is just the way our brains work. This is like basic human psychology. When we're anxious and feeling helpless, we're more likely to believe theories and ideas that are a little bit more questionable. So it's really natural right now for a lot of people to have questions about the vaccine process and to feel like they're not, to buy into ideas that under normal circumstances, they might say, no, that can't be right. So I want to acknowledge that that is a normal human process, and that if when you're talking to your clients, your family members, whoever it is, I think validating their concerns is really important. It's okay to have questions about this, and it's okay, and feeling helpless is something that we can work on together. So one of the key things that we can do to return a sense of agency to ourselves is to look at the differences between the vaccines, is to really be able to return a sense of choice to us by finding the vaccine that might be best for us. So right now, the vaccine supply is really constrained, and you're not going to get a lot of choice if you're getting vaccinated today. You're going to get what you get. But in a few months, you're going to have some choices. And I think differentiating between the vaccines is really helpful to name it, to tame it, right? To get into kind of what the differences are between the vaccines and maybe choose one that's the right one for you. A year ago, it would be really hard to believe that we would have the choice between antibody testing, rapid testing, PCR testing for COVID, right? In the same way, the industry and the market is going to move quickly, and the vaccine, it's worth kind of pointing out the differences between the vaccines. And it's not just a matter of like what the vaccine is or does, but there are other aspects of the vaccine development which might really make one vaccine appeal to someone over another vaccine. So for example, some folks would like to get a vaccine from a very large, well-established, long-time company. I can totally understand that sentiment. Others might be a little bit distrustful of Big Pharma and would prefer a startup. If you're an early adopter, an innovator type, then maybe you've got a little bit of a little preference for the startups. So two of the companies, Moderna and Novavax, fit the startup mold. The big companies are AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. Those are the vaccines that are kind of being discussed or on the market already. So I think there's opportunities to differentiate between the vaccines in a scientific way, in a reasonable way that will give people back some choice. So each state has its own vaccine distribution channels at the moment. And as the vaccines enter pharmacies, there's going to be more of an option to choose where you get your vaccine. Vaccinefinder.org, I think, is a new site that CDC launched this morning, which aggregates some of the information and will be helping as it comes online to direct you to which pharmacies have which vaccines and how much is in stock. I'm just going to pause there to see if there's questions. Amanda, should I be looking on the questions?
If you would like to, we've had a couple that have come in from Facebook that I had forwarded over to you.
Okay, cool. Let me take a look. Okay, so there's a question about claims about COVID vaccines causing miscarriage and fertility problems. Okay, we can get to that. And so this other question is, for normal drugs, what would you say to the argument that it takes normal drugs longer to be approved in the first place, so continued monitoring isn't needed, pertaining to long-term side effects being unknown? Okay, so I think this is a good time to address that question, and thank you for whoever sent it. So with a normal drug approval process, the review process does take longer, but that's often a function of the number of staff available to do that review. But it doesn't. But even in a normal approval process, it doesn't absolve the company of having to do long-term safety monitoring. All products have to have that anyways, and there's a fairly robust system that is used to detect those kinds of serious safety concerns that emerge. So that stuff is all in place, and I'll show you exactly how that's going to work with the COVID vaccines. And let me just look at the other questions, and maybe we'll just dive right into that since that question came up. Okay, so we'll get to there's another question about about getting the vaccine after having COVID, and I'll cover that in just a little bit more towards the end, but I will get to that question, don't worry. Okay, so let's talk about safety, all right? So safety science is a kind of it's like a really not exciting field most of the time, and we do our work quietly, and it's a pretty like cautious group of folks who are really interested in kind of pulling together pharmacology, animal studies, human studies, surveillance data, and really synthesizing what's there. It's really hard to trust any single source when it comes to drug safety, largely because molecules don't change that much, but humans do. When you put the same molecule into lots of different bodies, you're going to get lots of different types of side effects and reactions. The clinical trials are usually small, right? Smaller than the population who's going to be getting the drug. And so when you go into like a bigger population, you always get kind of weird things show up that you have to make a really careful causal ascertainment. You have to really figure out, did this vaccine cause this problem? Did this drug cause this problem? Okay, so for the COVID vaccine specifically, well, actually, there's a new surveillance system that is the first active surveillance system that has ever been created for a vaccine in the United States, and it's called vSafe. And I guess, Amanda, would you mind dropping that link that I shared earlier? And what Amanda is going to give you right now is a work in progress, and it's a cheat sheet that we are making that kind of captures a lot of the information we're talking about here today. I'll update this with the questions that we get during the talk today, and we'll put this on Medium so you can share it more easily. But if you scroll down to the section where it says vaccine safety, you'll see some links. And don't get distracted by other stuff in there yet. We'll get to all that in just a moment. But the part on vaccine safety gives you the links to vSafe. And so vSafe is so after people get the vaccine, they can click onto vSafe, and you have the QR code. That QR code should work if it's on your screen and you point your phone at it and you've already gotten a vaccine. You don't have to download any apps or anything. It's just on a web browser on your phone, and then it will send you reminders via text message, checking in with you to see if you've had side effects and how that's going. Now, if you do have a side effect that's a bit concerning, there's a way to trigger the system to get an actual call from a vaccine safety specialist from CDC or the FDA to call you and ask you more about the details of what has happened. Okay, so this is a enhanced surveillance system, and it's definitely a step beyond what has happened in the United States ever. Now, I happen to have built 13 of these side effect safety tracking mobile apps for countries in Europe and in Africa, and I can tell you that they provide really important information, but they provide you different information than what is in the clinical trials. These apps are really cool because they can they get beyond the clinical trial populations, and they let patients directly report their experiences and lets you amplify your voice. Okay, and so what we've seen in other countries when we've used these mobile tools for side effect surveillance is that patients pick up on subtle cues that they don't necessarily talk to their doctors about. They pick up on like product quality complaints, like these instructions weren't clear, or this this tablet is falling apart or crumbling, all sorts of things like that. So you don't, when you're using these systems, you don't have to feel like you need to be totally certain that that your side effect was caused by this vaccine or this drug. Instead, your job is what you're able to do is provide information that even if you're uncertain about the causal connection there, the scientists on the back end are trained in specifically this really narrow task of of trying to figure out kind of what could be causally linked based on pharmacology and clinical data and animal data and computational models and lots of other science. So that's one way that this is that the surveillance for COVID side effects is going to be different than in previous places. Okay, so so that's about monitoring of side effects, and I'm just looking back here through the questions to see if I missed anything. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what the side effects are that we can expect. In the clinical trials, where there was, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people in each of those trials, which is a lot of people, right? And there are some clear patterns from the data. And when I update this cheat sheet, I'll put in direct links to all those data sources too, so you can see what's been published and reviewed. For the vaccines that are on the market, sweating, fever, chills, tiredness, and headache. Those are the 5, okay? Sweating, fever, chills, tiredness, and headache. Those are the 5 that you can expect for your whole body. You're going to get some arm soreness at the site of where you got the vaccine, and you might have some stiffness in your arms. That kind of stuff, ice works great. Moving your arm and doing exercises with them works really great. But what's a little bit different with this vaccine, especially the ones where you have to get 2 doses, is that the second dose is going to be worse than the first dose for most people under the age of 50. Okay, and that means that after you probably feel a little tired maybe after the first shot, but after the second shot, you may want to think about, if you have the luxury, to take a day off, take a sick day, and just be prepared to, feel a little crappy that day. Sometimes and the younger you are, so from 18 or 20 on up to 50, kind of if you're in that range, if you're in your 20s, 30s, that second shot is going to be a more intense experience, and you may well be sweating in your bed sheets, and it's a little gross, but it will pass. It usually doesn't last more than a day, more than a night, and then it goes away really quickly after that. But it's something that we're not used to as a paradigm. We're used to either getting one shot, like your flu shot or your tetanus, and kind of forgetting about it, kind of like, oh yeah, I feel a little sore there in the morning. But with this one, the second time around, it's going to hit a little harder. And when we're thinking about service providers, and especially for those of us who work with homeless people and with people experiencing homelessness and and folks who are unstably housed in general, if you're couch surfing, that second day is going to be a little bit uncomfortable for you. And so negotiating that ahead of time, figuring out places for people to go after they get their second shot is definitely something that's worth considering and planning for. Now, this is where having the choice in vaccines really starts to matter, where if you have vaccines that are 2 doses, where the second one's going to be a bit more of a hard hit, then maybe for folks who don't have the luxury of taking that second day off, or don't have a place to go through that, maybe the single dose vaccine would be a better choice based on that alone, everything else being equal. Okay, so those are the main side effects to be thinking about. But let's get back to what I just said about everything else being equal. Now, there's a lot of passive pharma marketing, I'll call it, to be generous, about how one vaccine is 90% effective or 94% effective, one is 95% effective, this one's 70% effective, 67% effective. These numbers are all over the place, but 90 sounds to us, right, in our heads like, oh yeah, that's legit, right? That's a big number. The reality is the numbers in the clinical trials are much smaller and are much there's much more nuance in the clinical trial numbers than that one summary would suggest. I don't like the New York Times on their vaccine summaries, for example, has just says efficacy 97% or 94% or whatever it is, right? I think that's really misleading. I think there's a lot of different things you could measure to determine if a vaccine is effective or not. So this is, excuse me just a second. So this is where the emergency use authorization this is where the rubber hits the road with that. The other thing that the emergency use authorization does is that it helps kind of set the tone for what it is that we measure to determine if a vaccine is effective, okay? So let's, zooming out for a second, right? Forget the regulatory world, forget the pharma world. I think there's 3 ways in which we can measure whether a vaccine is effective. We can see if it prevents infections, we can see if it prevents hospitalizations, and we can see if it prevents deaths. All right. Those are 3 totally different. The way that you would measure each of those is really different, right? So with deaths, you're looking at mortality data, and it's really intense, right? But it's going to be a small number of folks who are going to die. After getting the vaccine, and you're going to have to figure out whether it's from their underlying cancer progression, or because they were in a car accident, or because it was a direct harm from the vaccine. So deaths are actually a really useful thing to keep an eye on, but you run into all sorts of really complicated, entangled questions, and it doesn't give you enough resolution to have a lot of confidence in a vaccine, just if it looks like it reduces all-cause mortality or COVID-specific mortality even. So then on the other end of the spectrum are infections, okay? So to really measure whether someone has been infected, you need to be testing them every few days, right? Because an infection might last just a couple of days, and that might not even be detected if you are measuring, if you're doing a mouth swab or a nasal swab, once a week. And so in order to really figure out whether infections are being prevented, you're going to have to ask the people in the clinical trial to be coming back all the time, every couple of days. And that gets really complicated. First of all, it's a huge burden to the participants in those trials. But second, it creates there's an avenue for your data to be biased because for some folks coming in every other day is going to be a burden that's way too high, and they're going to drop out of the clinical trial. When they drop out of the clinical trial, you're not going to know what happened to them, and maybe it's the folks who are sicker who are dropping out of the clinical trial. And if that happens, then you may actually end up thinking your vaccine is safer than it is. So in between is hospitalizations. Hospitalizations is what most of the vaccines have really kind of focused in on. And the reason for this is because you can measure hospitalizations the easiest of these 3 things, okay? So between infections, deaths, and hospitalizations, you can actually count the number of people coming into a hospital because, you're going to have to build them, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure that the clinical trials are basically relying on to detect hospitalizations. And so that's what the main endpoint in the trials has been, is do these vaccines prevent hospitalizations? Now, for an emergency use authorization, that's a totally legitimate endpoint to be looking at. It's probably the one that I care about the most because that's the one that's going to have the most cost for our healthcare system, is going to be the most debilitating to the most number of people. Like I said, with the emergency use authorization, that's an acceptable decision to make. When we go from having an emergency use authorization to a full approval, that's when the question of those other two questions really come into play. Did it prevent infections? Did it prevent deaths? So in order to get a full approval, it's not enough to just show the hospitalizations. You really have to show some impact on the infections as well as the deaths. So to do that, it takes kind of a lot of other kinds of study apparatus to really get those pieces of data. With infections, you're only going to be able to get that information for maybe a few thousand people because it is so intensive of a process. So, so that's all part of kind of why there's a lot of discrepancy between vaccines in terms of how effective they are. All of them look very good, like 75% or so or more protection on hospitalizations. So I don't have a lot of concern with them at the moment. The question of variance is really is something that we're keeping a really close eye on, and it's something that we don't know how well some of the vaccines are going to work. We know some of them, like the AstraZeneca one, doesn't work great in the South African strain. We're going to have to see how that evolves. We may end up having a booster shot for some of the vaccines to give our immune systems a better chance to get those genetic variations in the virus. So when we're talking about choice, when we're talking about which vaccine is right for you, keeping all this in mind is really important because it's easy to just take what is being told to us and not taking the time to kind of look behind and asking. Like if you see 95% effective, ask yourself, I think we should be asking, what was that for? Was that on deaths? Was that on infections? Was that on hospitalizations? And see if that's if that's something that's meaningful to you. To me, like I said, preventing hospitalizations is really important and a wonderful, I think, like one of the better endpoints that we could be using at the moment. Okay. So there were some other questions in the that we had received, and let me come back to those now. There was one question that we had received earlier about is it safe to get the vaccine if you have an allergy to penicillin? And the answer to that is yes, that shouldn't be a problem. The reasons to the mechanisms by which your body has an allergic reaction to penicillin are really different from the few allergy reactions that we've been seeing with the vaccines. So it's kind of allergy is allergic reaction are kind of very broad words that really can mean a lot of different things. And with penicillin allergies, there's like a particular molecule of sulfur in a particular spot in the penicillin in penicillin that really is responsible for causing that allergic reaction, whereas there's no penicillin in the COVID vaccines at all. Okay. So on the topic of what is in the vaccines, this is another area where there's a lot of questions. And I think it's natural, once again, to have these questions. And I think it's actually healthy for us to be questioning what goes into vaccines as long as we are approaching the information in a very rational way. So the vaccines, once you get it in your arm, it doesn't come with like a label that says like, here's all the ingredients, right? Or most vaccines would not. And so what I provided for you in the link that Amanda sent around, thank you, Amanda, is links to the ingredient list for each of the 5 major vaccines that are being considered. And before you dive into those, let me just tell you where those come from, okay? So the links are to the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the National Institute of Health. And the information comes from the approval process. In order to get the drug approved, the companies have to specify what goes in it. The penalties for lying about this are really, really high. this is like one of the few reasons a drug can be instantly taken off the market is if there is inaccuracies in inaccuracies in what is in the ingredient list. This is something that has a lot of scrutiny and is not a place where there's any real room for cheating. Okay, so what's in there, I think, is generally considered to be a fairly accurate idea of what's in there, of what's in the actual vials. In addition, there are inspections that are done, so it's like by FDA to the facilities that make the vaccines, and those give you a bit of a better sense of confidence that what you're seeing in these lists is actually what goes into vaccines. Okay, if you click on those links, you'll see there. So you'll see kind of all the information about the vaccine in there, and the last of those plus signs says ingredients and appearance. And buried way down there at the end is the information that we're talking about. And you'll see a lot of really long words like 1,2-dimethyl rac, right. That's too long for us to really understand what's going on. So in the cheat sheet that I sent you all, or Amanda sent you guys, I divided up all of the ingredients and all the vaccines into these 5 categories. And you can take a look on your own time and kind of going through and explaining which of those, which ingredient comes from what and where that and why those are used. Okay. I don't see anything really weird in these vaccines. I don't see anything out of the ordinary. In fact, it looks like most of the ingredients are actually more tame than in the vaccines that are used in children. So there's been a lot of debate in the vaccine manufacturing development world to get better fillers into vaccines and make vaccines less painful, have less side effects. And so what we're seeing here is a lot of that science come to fruition, where instead of using like aluminum salts, for example, have been used for decades, for actually like 100 years in vaccines, to get your immune system to pay more attention to the vaccine after it goes in your body. None of these vaccines have that. None of them have any of the preservatives, the metal-based preservatives that have been a topic of a lot of conversation with some of the childhood vaccines. None of that's in here. These vaccines don't even have preservatives. So your, the soda in your fridge probably has more preservatives than than any of these vaccines do. That's part of the reason why they have to be kept cold, and part of the reason why it's taking longer to roll them out. So that information is there for you to look at. And as you go through them, you may decide that that one of the vaccines is better for you than the others. And like I said, you're not going to get to be able to choose right now. But for most of us on this call, I'm in the very last category group. By the time this fall comes around and I may be eligible, there's going to be choices between vaccines. And we can use that to express and feel what to find the one that we feel is best for us. There was a couple of questions on whether we should get the vaccine if we've had it already, if we've had COVID already. So should we get the vaccine if we've had COVID already? And the answer to that, I think, is simply yes. We don't know how long the natural immunity is going to last, and the last thing you want to do when you're, sitting at a bar or a restaurant, 2 years from now, is to be wondering, should I go introduce myself to that person? But maybe I should have gotten that second shot. Maybe you don't want this like lingering around in your brain of any kind of uncertainty whether your immunity has waned or not. So I think getting the vaccine, the second dose, the vaccine, even if you had it, is a really good idea. Right now, it seems like we're moving towards, if you've had COVID before and you've recovered and you can show that you have antibodies, you may only need 1 shot instead of 2. That would be really great. Or it might be a reason to just get the single shot as well. And if you've had it twice, if you've had confirmed COVID more than once, then first of all, I'm really sorry for you. That must have been a terrible experience. And I think that's a rare enough situation where you probably want to be asking that to your doctor directly. I don't think there's, as of yet, blanket recommendations. Folks who are getting, in very rare cases, people are getting COVID more than one time, and there's a bunch of different reasons that could happen. Sometimes it could be that the virus has mutated, you're getting a different strain. It could be that your immune system, there's something else going on. So in those cases, I think that's a conversation with the doctor. Okay. Amanda, can you help remind me if there are some other questions that I should be looking at?
I believe that you have gotten to the questions that we have had that have come through thus far.
Okay. All right. Well, there's one other dimension to this then that I think is really gets at the experiences that a lot of us have with these vaccines and this whole process, and that's distrust. There's a lot of reasons why people may there's a lot of reasons why people may mistrust the healthcare system. For a lot of folks who are from marginalized communities, whether that's drug use or whether you're from a group that's been stigmatized by racism or by other isms, there's a lot of reasons to distrust for our own experiences to inform how we interact with the medical system and how much we're willing to believe what's being said about the COVID vaccines. So when it comes to racism among against African Americans, there's a lot of hand-wringing about the historical Tuskegee experiments, Henrietta Lacks, and a lot of other kind of historical atrocities that have been committed on Black folks in the name of science, right? These are things that happened and they can't be ignored. On a practical level, when you're talking to people who are mistrustful of the medical care system, it's more likely that it's their own experiences with racism that they've experienced within the medical system that are leading to that mistrust. Okay, there's going to be this background of, yeah, these atrocities have happened, but what's usually more proximal is I went in and this is what they said to me and this is how they treated me. Those things you can't erase those experiences, right? And it's a really difficult, it's really hard to get ourselves to slow down enough to listen to those experiences, to empathize and bring our emotions and bring our ability to engage on that level, on this emotional level with their experiences that they have had. So I can't wave a magic wand and undo the past. We're not going to be able to undo what is very justifiable centuries of oppression that have led to these kinds of feelings and responses. So what can we do? Well, I think we start with acknowledging that these things have happened, start with acknowledging what's happened in their own lives and be there to listen. And I think one of the important strategies that my coworkers and colleagues who are African American and have been dedicating their past year to working in their own communities has been to emphasize how important it is to have to return to family connections, to be able to have those big meals and to have those big family gatherings, and kind of emphasizing that that's the reason to get the vaccine, emphasizing that there's a cultural identity that we can express again together once enough of us have been vaccinated. Those tend to be the strategies that my colleagues suggest. when they're when they're out there talking to their communities. I want to leave you with this one thought of you don't have to convince everybody, okay? There are folks who are going to be very hesitant and are just not going to get the vaccine no matter what you say. There's going to be others who are going to be standing in line overnight with like concert tickets to get the vaccine, okay? And there's not much you can do to change those folks' minds. The advertisers know this. They call this audience segmentation. And in public health, we don't always realize that we don't have to, that there's only certain types of minds that we can change with information and with communication. And that's largely what's called the movable middle. And so folks who have concerns about vaccine, validate them and understand what it is that's really bothering them, and give them some of these resources that I've shown you today. If you think those are helpful, you can be in touch with me and I can try to get you others if there's new questions that arise. But for the folks who are really, really hesitant, who are absolutely never going to get this vaccine, there's not much that you can do with your words to change their minds. You can, if you get your vaccine, you can be around them. You can tell them, oh yeah, I got it, and you might just leave it at that. If enough people do it, maybe they'll change their minds. But trying to convince the really entrenched ends of the spectrum takes a lot of time and effort, and is more about who they know and what their own social networks are doing and saying about the vaccine. And that's something that words and pieces of paper and links to websites are not going to change. So in some ways, pick your battles, respectfully disagree if it's a conversation that's not going anywhere. And I think, cut yourself a break a little bit. We're not going to be able to convince everybody, but we can be respectful to everybody and the experiences they've had. So let me see if there's any other questions that have come up. Okay. If you guys have any other questions, please put them in now. But I hope I've given you a few tools and some thoughts on how to reframe the vaccine questions in a way that respects autonomy, restores a sense of agency to people by talking about the differences between vaccines, and gives you some vetted information that might help you in those conversations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dasgupta. If anybody else has any questions, we do still have a couple more minutes, so feel free to put them into the chat. If anybody needs any type of an attendance certificate, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat box as well, and I can provide that to you. I know some employers require that. There are no CEs available for this, though. And if anybody has any questions after the event, feel free to email them to me as well, and I'm more than happy to pass them along to Dr. Dasgupta. All right, well, it looks like everybody got all of their questions answered today. So
amazing. Thanks for your attention, guys.
And thank you so much for speaking with us today, Dr. Dasgupta. And I'll stay on so that everybody has a chance to copy any information they need out of the chat. But for anybody else, you are free to go, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.